What's up everybody and welcome back to the channel. In this video for the First Descendant, we're going to be looking at NAZEISTRA'S Devotion, a craftable / researchable ultimate hand cannon in the game that is basically all about debuffing enemies and therefore is really good at group play as well as void intercept bosses. Now, just as a prelude before we focus on the weapon and go more into the detail of the build, something that needs to be mentioned is the fact that at the moment right now, the meta in the First Descendant is pretty much divided into two camps in a way. First and foremost, you have the idea that mostly players want to avoid mechanics of bosses and essentially just blitz them down as fast as possible. And this is of course given to the rise of, in popularity of descendants like Lepic and, Haley, because they are able to burst the bosses down fast enough so that you don't necessarily have to worry about mechanics and everything like that, because you're dealing so much upfront damage or consistent damage that you can essentially kill the boss before any of the mechanics become a problem. Now, at the moment right now, it feels like the developer is dealing with this, let's say, power creep by essentially giving us bosses like Gluttony. And Gluttony, by example, is exactly against this current meta. Gluttony has such a huge amount of defense, from a skill perspective as well as just from a bullet perspective, just in general very strong defense stats, that Gluttony forces you to actually play the mechanics. Now, that's not to say that you can't score fast kills on Gluttony, and there are definitely ways in which you can do this, but oftentimes that involves in you actually buffing up your own team to even greater damage or debuffing Gluttony so that he can take more damage, thereby essentially nullifying the increase in defense that he has over the team. So it's not to say that we won't see bosses in the future that can be killed just as fast as something like Devourer can currently in the meta or so, but it does seem that as a natural counteract to the power creep that is happening in the game right now, the developer is going to keep on giving us bosses like Gluttony that will have mechanics which need to be learned, or you would need to find ways to circumvent those mechanics by essentially giving yourself the upper hand. Now, the reason why I did that whole preamble and why I explained that is because while NAZEISTRA'S is not exactly the most, amazing thing when it comes from a damage perspective and is absolutely outdamaged by something like a Thunder Cage or an Enduring Legacy, its utility comes from the fact that it is able to elevate your teammates' damage. So it is a true support weapon. So with that in mind, let's go ahead and just look at it in a little bit more detail, and let's focus on exactly what the unique ability of this weapon does. Now, before we do that, just from a stats perspective, the NAZEISTRA'S stat distribution is super sexy and has very high crit rate, very high crit damage, and has very decent weak point damage, which means that it can be built towards either one of those sides with a preference. You could focus more on weak, you could focus more on crit, or you can kind of like try to straddle down the middle and get the best of both worlds, which is kind of like what we're going to do with this build. But looking at the unique ability, it's not incredibly difficult to understand. It's actually very straightforward. Basically, what this weapon does is whenever you shoot an enemy's weak point, it inflicts a debuff called Devotion Mark. What Devotion Mark does is it reduces the enemy that it hits its defense by 30%. Now, if you have a lower level version of this, as you can see, I have a 4 out of 4. This stat is heavily increased by you increasing more levels into this weapon. So when you start out, this will be 15%, which is not a lot, but it's still pretty decent. But of course, you then, when you hit 4 out of 4, will have 30%, which is the maximum version of this debuff. Now, 30%, of course, is more depending on how much more damage the enemy has. So this is why this weapon is not that great just for normal, mobbing and so on, because you'll mostly be one-tapping those enemies in any case. So it doesn't really matter that you're dropping their defense. However, this can be kind of cute against some of the more tougher Void Reactor bosses and bosses at the end of intercepts or infiltrations rather. But as you can see, this is very much meant to be a weapon that you basically use against bosses in the Void Intercept category, things like Gluttony and so on, because you're able to just put this massive debuff on them. Now, why I say that this weapon is more suited for group play and not for solo is because the duration of the debuff is not that great. It's 3 seconds. So as a solo, it becomes almost impossible for you to keep this debuff up and switch and get shots off with a second weapon. This weapon does not is no slouch in the damage department and actually can push out quite a bit of DPS by you just using the NAZEISTRA'S Devotion and then getting that debuff on the enemy and keep pounding damage into them to deal more damage to them is absolutely obviously something that you can and should be doing. But specifically when it comes to group play and you keeping this debuff up on enemies so that your teammates with like Enduring Legacies and Thundering Cages and all this shit can just basically capitalize from all of this additional damage that they can deal due to the debuff. Now, it also has a secondary effect that it can do, which is probably something that you'll use it less for, but is also something that you can use it for, and that is that you can actually buff your allies. So it's not just about debuffing enemies, you can actually buff your allies as well. And what you can do is, if you have enough MP in your gun, on your character, you can shoot one of your allies with this, and it will give them 30% shield recovery. So it is something that you can just boost up your allies a little bit. Although, I mean, it's hinging on the fact that you have that MP available and so on, and generally speaking, I haven't really seen people use this a lot for that, but hey, power to you if you do. Now, talking substats on the NAZEISTRA'S, since you'll be mostly using this against Void Intercept bosses, additional Colossus damage is a good thing to roll on there. I would say you would need to choose between additional Colossus damage or weak point damage. I think either one of those two is fine. You are in any case not the main damage dealer when it comes to this. You are playing a support class, a support weapon, and so therefore weak point damage is fine as well, because you'll be shooting weak points in any case to trigger the debuff effect, so it's neither here nor there. Firearm attack is absolutely necessary, so is critical hit damage and critical hit rate, because you have both of those stats, hit rate and hit damage, being fairly high on this weapon, so you can get quite close to nearly maxing those out, which means that when you do actually shoot and when you do deal damage, it is quite chunky as well. Then getting to the build itself, as I've said, pretty much you are trying to push up your critical hit chance and your critical hit damage as much as possible, while also leaning into weak point damage quite a bit. Now, as usual, your main staples on any weapon should be action and reaction and rifling reinforcements. Those are standard includes for any gun because it just elevates the damage profile of the weapon. And usually what you would do, the third thing that you would put in would be fire rate up. But fire rate up in a hand cannon doesn't necessarily translate to more, DPS for you, and it's far more important to actually make those shots that hit harder instead of being able to shoot more out. There's actually a DPS loss compared to just stacking, the basic stats like crit hit, crit damage, and weak point instead of stacking, fire rate. We do want to put more bullets into the magazine though. This is quite important because by default NAZEISTRA'S has a fairly small-ish magazine, so you want to be adding more bullets into that. And then our first damage increase here will be weak point side, just a nice fat 35% increase there. Then we're gonna focus on increasing our crit hit and our crit damage. Concentration priority does that for us. Edging shot does that for us, even though we have a 15% firearm attack loss there. The point is we're gonna get so close to almost maxing our crit hit rate that that will be fine, because those crit hits will hit really nice and juicy. Better concentration and better insight takes care of our crit hit rate and crit hit damage, of course. And then we're taking weak point insight, which gives us an additional 20% of weak point damage and some more, even though it's very small, but some more 1.5% firearm critical hit rate. Now when we look at our stats here, we'll see that we get relatively close to pretty much 3 out of every 4 shots being a crit. I mean, just looking at the percentage, so almost 75%. And we have a 4 times multiplier on there, which is very, very, very good. Now, we also have a 5 times multiplier on weak point damage. And almost all of our shots should be landing on a weak point, because the whole point of using this gun is to inflict the debuff. So you should be hitting weak points, and then when you do, you're going to be hitting this much damage because of the additional weak point damage multiplier that you have here, which is fantastic. And that naturally makes Weak Point Expansion the best ultimate mod for us to use. This says that on a weak point hit, we have a 40% weak point damage increase, which is just massive, and it's really going to elevate your damage profile. Now, I did do some testing, and there's another ultimate mod which also seems to be very, very juicy and does inflate the stats of the weapon by like quite a lot. Let me just quickly switch to it here. So what I'm referring to is, of course, Dopaminergic Activate, this bad boy over here. So this one, you'll notice that as soon as I slap this on, and I'll quickly go back here so you can see the DPS here, and if I save now, bloop, it inflates the stats quite a lot. And you'll see over here, the effect of dopaminergic activate actually gives us a 95% critical hit chance and a 5.6 multiplier. We see that our weak point damage, of course, comes down. Now, you have to bear in mind that when you switch the mods like this, the point is this here shows you essentially the triggered effect. So this means that when dopaminergic activates, when dopaminergic activates, this is the effect that you're gonna have. And this says that on weak point hit, firearm critical hit rate gets plus 45% and firearm critical hit damage gets plus 70%. For a very long time, this is what I was actually using, and then I decided to sit down and do some tests. And I can show you here just some figures. Maybe I can just move my face over here. So this is just a super small sample size, but the bottom line is over time, this is basically three sets of 33 shots on both dopaminergic and weak point. And then you can see that weak point always inches out over the top. So this is a sample set that you're looking at here. I repeated this experiment 3 times at different distances and all of that stuff to try and just, you know, deal with all of the different variables that could potentially come at you when you fight a boss. Also, you have to bear in mind that with these, I hit every single shot. So you have to also assume that some of the shots you're going to miss. And there, it just makes it even more important that weak point rises probably, the ultimate mod rises probably to the top, because the point is, yes, you do have that cooldown, but then if you miss 1 or 2 shots or something like that, your next shot, when the cooldown's down, is just going to hit nice and fat again. But feel free to try both of these out. I'd be remiss if I didn't, you know, admit that I really do like the fact that this inflates the stats like this and really makes the gun look fucking nasty. But overall, I will definitely advise you to rather use Weakpoint Expansion, because that's just going to give you more DPS over time. Even though the main point of this weapon is not straight DPS, but rather the fact that you want to be debuffing enemies, while also, you know, at least not being like, you know, shooting like marshmallows at the enemy and actually being able to deal a little bit of damage yourself. Now, lastly, I just want to mention that which you know, Descendant this is really for, though, because the point is, again, classes are not really something that's being respected in the game right now. People tend to try to play like DPS classes, build very glass cannon, and push bosses down as fast as possible. However, if you are playing some of the, let's call them true support classes in the game, and this would be something like Luna, it would be something like Ajax, it would be something like Eugen, this weapon is a very, very natural fit for you to use, because you are already concentrating on essentially buffing up your allies, keeping your allies alive, giving them more advantages in combat, and then you're also holding a weapon in your hand that debuffs whichever enemy you're fighting and lets your allies deal more damage to them. So super, super natural fit. I would, however, advise you against using this with, like, for example, Enzo. Enzo, even though Enzo is a support character and a very, very good one, in my opinion, probably the best in the game, the point is, it's very much expected of Enzo himself to also deal damage. So in a team setup, even though as Enzo you are buffing everybody else's crit hit and crit damage and things like that, you should also be using something like an Enduring Legacy and just pushing out a lot of damage, because it's kind of like what makes Enzo so fucking good. But then when it comes to support classes, like I said, Ajax is fucking amazing with this gun, just being able to pop up shields and stuff, which means you can then stand still behind your shields and make sure that all of your weak point hits hit is awesome. Eugen seems to be super popular at the moment right now. This is another good fit as well, because you can debuff while healing your allies and, you know, buffing them and all that shit. And then of course Luna is just a buff machine, and you can just further on increase the efficiency of the support that you're providing to your team by also, you know, debuffing the enemy. It does fit in other scenarios, but those 3 come easiest to me in my mind. And if you're playing any one of those 3 characters, I encourage you to try out NAZEISTRA'S Devotion. Your team might just fucking love you for it. And that's it for the video. Thank you so much for watching, especially if you made it this far. Let me know in the comments down below if you have been messing with NAZEISTRA'S, if you have some other support weapons which you prefer. There are some other support weapons in the game. Eventually I will get to each and every one of them on this channel. So if I haven't covered a weapon yet and it's something that you're looking for, go ahead and tell me in the comments and I'll bump it to the top of the list and we'll get a video out so we can discuss it and have a look at it. Other than that, it's just super important to me that you have a fantastic morning, afternoon, or evening, wherever you are in the world. Until next video, fucking cheers.